Hey y'all, I'm Kim Stewart, host of the Book Marketing Mania podcast, and I'm so glad you're tuning in today. So let's dig into podcast pitching and talk about putting together your pitching strategy. Whether you're pitching yourself or you're outsourcing tasks to a virtual assistant or an intern. By starting with your strategy, you're going to save yourself time when you start researching and pitching. And if you or your publisher are hiring a PR rep, lucky you, they do all this for you. So there's 4 parts to your pitching strategy: your why, your who, your what, and your where. And it'll really help you to brainstorm each of these before you get going or before you pay someone to research or pitch for you. And I recommend you use a Google Doc or a Google Sheet to brainstorm each piece of your strategy, as that's super easy to update and share with somebody else to help you and for you to add to it as you go along in your podcast guesting journey. So I have a Google Doc in my Podcast Pitching 101 mini course, along with a spreadsheet for tracking your research. And you can check that out at bookmarketingmania.com and click on course. And I'll put a link here in your player show notes too. So first up, let's talk about your why, and that is your goals for pitching. So starting with your goals first will help you to measure the return on your investment of your time, because it takes a lot of time to research podcast, send email pitches, record the interview, promote the interview, and the financial investment too if you're outsourcing any of your research or pitching. So, as authors, we typically think our main goal for guesting on podcast is to sell books, right? But there are so many other benefits to podcast pitching, and depending on where you are on your author journey, your goals will be different along the way. So I'll run through some of the goals you may have, and if you want to hear more of these in depth, be sure to tune in to episode 3, where I go through 9 ways guesting on podcast helps build your author platform. So why are you pitching? Here are some of the goals you may have for guesting on podcast. Obviously, sell your books and programs. You might want to just have a burning message on your heart and want to share your message with as many women as possible. You may have the goal of growing your email list and your social media with your ideal readers. You may want to establish relationships with podcast hosts for future collaborations. You may want to attract agents and publishers by showing them that you're serving your readers today. You may want to gain exposure for your own podcast if you're a podcast host. You may want to create content to repurpose. You may want to increase website traffic. You may want to go from unknown author to celebrated go-to guest. You want to build your credibility and be known for the things you talk about on podcast. Y'all, just literally last week, I connected 7 people I know who are experts in a specific subject with podcast hosts looking for specific guests. These guests are not my clients or students, but they're friends I've met online, and I've heard them as podcast guests. So I know they are the perfect person to suggest when hosts come asking, or I see them post on social media that they're in need of guests. So again, it's really important to first know the why of your podcast pitching, because it's not always just to sell your books. So if your goal right now might be building relationships with podcast hosts, I definitely want you to check out episode 15, where I share 6 ways to build relationships with hosts before pitching. And really, no matter what the goal is on the list, if you're going to be pitching yourself, I definitely recommend you check out that episode. Okay, so you know your why, your goals for being a guest on podcast. Now let's talk about the what in our strategy, which is your topics. Now, typically, I would start with the who of your target readers, but for all of you Christian nonfiction authors, I really want you to think outside the box when you're thinking of all the topics you can talk about. So what topics are you pitching? You want to be very specific. You want to have topics that bring value to the listeners and naturally lead them towards your call of action to fulfill your goals, whether that's join your email list, buy your book, connect with you on social, visit your website, join your programs. And I like keeping a bank of topics. For those of you wanting to guest around your book release, you may want to focus only on topics from your book, especially when your goal is to sell books, right? But you'll notice shows may have covered your topic. Can you choose another topic and another take on the topic? Can you find a topic they haven't covered that will bring value to their listeners? This will be so much easier if you have a bank of topics to turn to. And remember, I shared this in episode 3. Every podcast host will link to your website in their show notes. So no matter what topic you're sharing about, if the listeners are your target audience, you serve them well through the interview, they're going to naturally want to connect with you afterwards to learn more. So if your home base is ready, we'll talk about that in another episode, and they see your book, your products, your services on your website or social, they'll still be able to check those out even if that wasn't the topic of your interview. So also, as you research podcasts to guest on, you're going to always come across new topics that maybe you hadn't thought of that you're an expert in, and you can add to your bank of topics. So just keep that long list going in the what part of your strategy, so you always have something to turn to. So let's talk about your what, your topics. You can share topics unique to your book. Again, this is not the book itself unless that's appropriate for the show. It's typically pulling topics from your book. Typically, hosts want to hear messages from your book. They want to hear takeaways and things that are going to bring value to their listeners' lives. So you want to pull out those chapters of the book and massage those into interview topics and talking points that hosts and listeners want to hear. You can share topics unique to you, your journey, personally or professionally. So you could share popular content on your blog, your social media, your podcast, other guest episodes you've done, whatever content you have that has really resonated with your target readers that could be pulled and made into podcast topics. You could talk about your Christian living topics on Bible study, moms on raising teens, meal planning, budgeting, self-care, grief, your cancer journey. You could talk about your professional journey as an author, a speaker, a podcaster, talk about your last book launch, talk about publishing, marketing. You could talk professionally, share your current profession outside of being an author. Maybe you're a life coach. Maybe you're a mental health professional. Maybe you're a teacher or your previous profession. All of those things have topics that you are an expert on that you could share. You can share topics unique to your programs, your coaching, your courses. You could share timely topics that are seasonal, New Year's resolutions, studying and reading your Bible at the first of the year, Mother's Day, Father's Day, meals, gift ideas, summer activities, back to school, holidays, mental health month, which is in May, breast cancer awareness month, autism awareness month, which is April. You could share timely topics that are in the news, right? When you see the headlines, think, is that something I could talk about on a podcast, or could I give a different take than what's being talked about in the news? And holy cow, y'all, when COVID shutdown happened, I was representing several authors with books for moms and lots of topics on motherhood. And these were authors that their books had been launched previously, but they wanted to get new attention with new readers on them. But all of a sudden, hosts were looking for guests to talk about homeschooling, mental health, working from home with kids, replacing speaking opportunities with podcast guesting, and just mom topics all about self-care, not about parenting. And luckily, all my guests could do this. So it was so perfect to be able to pivot and find new topics for my clients to talk about, but only because we kind of had kept a bank going and I knew their content and knew what to pull from. Okay, so now you know your why, your goals for pitching, your what, your topics you're going to pitch. Now let's talk about your who. Who is your target audience? So remember your goals for guesting on podcasts and be specific. Are you trying to reach Christian women, men, moms, boy moms, wives, entrepreneurs, ministry leaders, parents, caregivers, medical professionals, clinicians? Is your topic only for a Christian audience, or can you speak to a secular audience too? If your goal is to share the message of your book, who are your target readers? If your goal is to sell your digital course or your coaching program, who are your ideal clients? If your goal is to share content, increase your website traffic, or become the go-to guest and build credibility, who are your target listeners that you want to hear your topic and click over to your website to discover more? This is why I like thinking through the what of your topics first before the who of your target listeners, because the possibilities are endless when it comes to podcast pitching and meeting your goals. So now you know your why, your goals, you know your what, your topics, your who, your target listeners. Now let's talk about your where, the types of podcasts to pitch that your topics would be a great fit for. So your where. So here is where we're just trying to finish out our strategy and kind of brain dump the types of shows we might be wanting to research. Authors' names we might want to research to see what shows they've been on, etc. So brainstorming our where will help when we find time to work on research or we outsource it to a VA or an intern. So always remember your goals for podcast pitching. You know who you're trying to reach, your target audience. You know what topics you can talk about. Now think of the podcast your target audience is listening to You might even be in your target audience. And what do you listen to? Ask your followers and subscribers on social, what do they listen to? Ask in Facebook groups. What podcasts have similar authors and bloggers guested on? Again, we're just brainstorming here. We're not researching yet. We're just jotting down names as you think of them. Again, this will be so much easier if you're planning to outsource. So what podcast have you guested on before? So it's important to even note those, even if you don't list them, just you may have a media page that lists them, but you want to make a note. Am I going to pitch to be a repeat guest? Was it a fit last time? Sometimes not. So you want to say, nope, I don't want to pitch these podcasts that I was guest on last time, or make a star by the ones that really had a great turnout. You saw a lot of book sales. You saw a lot of signups for your email list. You might just use those shows to research similar shows. You might see where that particular podcast host has guested. And you also want to note, if you don't want to pitch again, like I said, be sure when you are vetting these shows later in your research, I would definitely check them out on social media. So if your values and their values don't line up, then you want to definitely make a little note, either by podcast name or just kind of a note for whoever's going to be helping you, that if they see this in the vetting, that you definitely don't want to add that podcast to the list. So now you have a strategy in place. And again, this changes as you go along your journey. Your goals are going to change. Like, you may take them a quarter at a time. And during launch season, you may only want to talk about the topic of your book, and your goal is only to sell books. But prior to that, you might be wanting to build your email list. Prior to that, you might have been trying to attract a publisher. Long after your launch, you might be wanting to get new eyes on an older book, or build your email list because you have a launch coming up of a new course or a new coaching program. Or even longer after that, you might be building your email list to get new launch team members for your next book. So always have your strategy in place, because that's going to really help you when you start researching and finding podcasts to pitch, and especially if you outsource it. So you'll have your strategy to help you get started. And that's, you'll know your why, which is your goals. You'll know your who, your target audience. You'll know your what, topics to pitch, and you'll know your where, your podcast to pitch. Then you can pull from that and just be like, okay, this quarter, this is my goal. This is who I'm looking to reach. This is what I want to talk about. And these are the type of podcast I want to pitch. And you could easily outsource that, or you could just batch some time yourself for research and then batch again for pitching and get it out the door so you can start getting more yeses. Okay, y'all. So next time, I'm going to share some tips to help you search out these targeted podcasts without it being so time consuming. And again, I go through this strategy and other things to help you kickstart your podcast outreach in my Podcast Pitching 101 mini course. And if you have any questions, just feel free to connect with me on Instagram at KimStewInspired, because I would love to help you get your podcast outreach on. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in 2 weeks to help you market your book one podcast at a time.